Welcome to Tales of American History, the Witnessing History Education Foundation podcast, educating Americans to understand the history of their country and of other countries so that they will appreciate the value of America's unique free institutions. It is history that teaches us to hope. Become an American hero who participates in our mission by joining us at witnessinghistory.org, the website of the Witnessing History Education Foundation. View for free the Foundation's documentary films on the website and on the Foundation's YouTube platform. View also the Foundation's free teacher education materials that conform to grade-level education standards on the Witnessing History website and at pbslearning.org. Follow Witnessing History on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Give generously to the Foundation on the website and support its current project, a 3-part film series on the American Revolution for public and cable television in honor of our country's 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The first film, The Shot Heard Round the World, is being released this week, just in time for the anniversary of Paul Revere's ride and the battles of Lexington and Concord. Now, take a journey back through time with Kent Masterson Brown and his guest, and let their storytelling transport you to the most compelling moments in American history. Today, Kent's guest is Peter Cozzens, the editor or author of 16 books on the Civil War and the Indian Wars. Kent and Peter will discuss an era of American history neither well understood nor thoroughly studied, what Peter calls the 100-year American War, or this country's struggle to reconcile its settlers' relationships with the Indian population. Welcome, Peter.
Peter, welcome.
Thank you very much, Kent.
It's great to have you here. We've waited a long time to finally get together again, and it's really fun to have you. So thanks for being here. Peter, you have a remarkable background in writing, book publishing, some 16 books you've written over the years. And all that time you were in the Foreign Service and in the Army. And I find it just amazing what you've been able to do over the years. And we first got to know one another, of course, in our interest in Civil War history. And you have written extensively on that, a book on the fighting in Murfreesboro, Stones River, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and those books were all extraordinarily well received and award-winning. But now you've turned the ship a little bit to the leeward, I guess, and have gotten into writing on the history of the Indian Wars. And tell the listeners, first of all, what got you to transform what you do into writing about the Indian Wars?
Well, although I still maintain a great personal interest in the Civil War, after having written so many books on the Civil War, I felt that I'd said all I had to say about the subject.
Yeah.
And I came to the subject of the Indian Wars, or to put it more broadly, with this trilogy I've just completed, the westward movement of the American Republic from the Appalachians to the West Coast and all the conflicts with American Indians that arose as a consequence of that. I came to this subject sort of through the back door. I had discovered the unpublished memoirs of a Civil War general named John Pope, who is best known as the loser of Second Battle of Bull Run. I discovered his unpublished memoirs and edited those for publication and ended up writing a biography of him. And I was stunned to discover that when he went out west and assumed an important command in the American West during the Civil War, that he quickly developed what you could rightly call pro-Indian sympathies. He very much sympathized with the plight of the American Indians in the West and the unjust treatment they were receiving from the U.S. government, and he understood that Indian wars were caused by white usurpation of Indian lands, and that the Indians themselves were the victims and not the cause of the wars, and I further discovered that those sentiments were not unique to John Pope, but also shared by many other commanders after the war in the West, like George Crook and Nelson Miles, Alfred Terry. The list goes on, of generals who really sympathized deeply with the Indians' plight. And as a consequence of that, I became interested in the Indian Wars in the West. And so my book on the subject, The Earth is Weeping, the epic story of the Indian Wars for the American West, which I'm happy to say did very well. I wrote that partly as a consequence of my interest that was sparked by the attitude of the generals that surprised me. And also I wrote it as a corrective to D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Which was, it's considered a classic, but it was very much a product of his time, the early 1970s. Yeah. And it was very distorted in his treatment of the subject. And my instincts were good on that, in that over a dozen New York publishers bid on my proposal to do this book on the Indian Wars in the West. Once I finished that, I realized that a lot happened east of the Mississippi River and west of the Appalachians that did more to determine the fate of the American Indians and made inevitable the conquest of the West than people recognized. So I gradually turned this into a trilogy that covered all the conflicts in the United States.
Interesting. So it's your interest in knowledge of Civil War history, and particularly knowledge of people like General Pope that got you into
precisely.
Yeah.
It was indirect. Yeah. And I did not start out intending to write a trilogy of that, like, again, cover the conflicts in the Deep South, the what was called the Old Northwest, the modern Midwest and the West. I thought I was writing a standalone book on the Indian Wars in the West, but I recognized that the other areas had not been properly treated, were not properly understood, and so it just kind of snowballed.
Yeah. The Earth is Weeping, that was your first one on the Indian Wars. And that came out when?
It came out in 2016, and it did indeed receive quite a nice reception. It won the Gilder Lehrman Prize, a major prize for the best work in English language on military history, and it's been translated into Russian, Chinese, Italian, she's Dutch, Spanish, published in the UK as well, and so there was a need and an interest in telling a balanced story of what happened in the West. Yeah.
Tell the listeners, when does that book start?
The narrative proper, although I do have a backstory, of course, setting the stage, but the narrative itself really takes off at the end of the American Civil War through the tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890. And those 2 decades and a half of fighting, those are the Indian Wars of popular imagination. When you think of Indian Wars and what's been done in cinema and in literature, people tend to think of the American West.
Can you give the listeners a kind of a synopsis of what your findings were?
Again, I wrote not only on the Plains Indian Wars, but on everything that occurred in the West, everything from the Apaches in the Southwest to the Nez Perce in the Pacific Northwest, and everything in between. And a number of things emerged from the book that actually surprised me to an extent. First and foremost, as General Pope and other leading commanders recognize, the Indians never instigated any of the conflicts. They were pushed against the wall and forced to fight to defend their lands, and they fought the only way they knew how, which was staging raids that often resulted in in innocent settlers being killed and whatnot. But they did not provoke the conflicts. Another thing that surprised me, and this seemed counterintuitive, and certainly was counter to most history up into my book. There was a sense that the Indians had some degree of unity in resisting, again, white encroachment on their lands, and that was not the case at all. In fact, there was no tribe in the West that resisted American encroachment that was wholly united against the United States, against the Army. There were always peace or accommodationist factions on the one hand, and factions that wanted to resist and maintain a traditional way of life within each tribe. And the only tribes that did maintain unity were those tribes such as the Pawnee and the Shoshone and the Crow Indians, who fought on the side of the Army against tribes like the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne. And that was a case of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, because these were tribes that had long suffered in the endemic intertribal warfare in the West, and they sought the government as allies. And that was interesting to see that there was such a lack of unity among the Indians. There was no sense of, I use the term in my book, Indianness among the Indians until it was far too late.
Yeah.
That was a surprise to me. Another theme that emerged was, that there's been a tendency in kind of academia and revisionist history to portray the U.S. government and the regular Army as being genocidal in their intent toward the Indians, and that was not the case. The U.S. government never advocated a policy of genocide, nor did the Army pursue that, with one notable exception. That was the Sand Creek Massacre that was perpetrated not by the regular Army, but by a bunch of gutter trash from Denver wearing volunteer uniforms.
Yeah.
The government's policy, it was judging it within the context of the times, not through a 21st century lens. It was rather enlightened, if not naive. If it was naive, but it was well intentioned. That was a belief shared not only by the government but by the strongest supporters of the Indians, that in order to survive, being so heavily outnumbered, we're talking about 75,000 Indians in the West, and living in among a population of 40 million American, white and other Americans. The belief that the only way they could survive was to become, quote, Christianized and civilized, unquote, and take up farming or cattle raising and become good Christian citizens. And the problem with that was that there was the administration of the policy was fraught with corruption on the part of the government. The Indians eventually saw their reservations that were promised them, and by treaty reduced again as the whites took up more and more land in the West. So it was one broken treaty after another, and the lands that they ended up with were by and large unsuitable to agriculture or even to cattle raising, and you combine that with the attempt of the government to to alter a centuries-old civilization overnight, and then compound that with the corruption that prevented the Indians from even getting that which was promised them, and it was a recipe for failure.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
again, there was never an intent to physically eradicate the Indians, but rather to, I mean, if you want to use the word genocide at all, it would be in terms of, say, cultural eradication, to change their culture so that they might survive, amid the millions and millions of Americans around them.
Yeah. Wow. You've also written a wonderful book on Tecumseh and the Prophet. That was your second book on the Indians.
Right. I did things sort of backwards chronologically. I initially had intended The Earth is Weeping to be a standalone book, but then I thought about it, and I realized that what happened between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, both north of the Ohio River in the Great Lakes region and what was then called in the early 1800s, late 1700s, the Old Northwest. What occurred there, and what occurred concurrently in the Deep South, the conflicts there really were the deciding factors in determining the Indians' fate and made inevitable their defeat in the West. In the late 18th century and early 19th century, through the War of 1812, the American Indians had a very good chance of retaining large portions of their land, both in the Deep South and in the Old Northwest. And Tecumseh and the Prophet, it's a dual biography of Chief Tecumseh, who, by most accounts, is considered to be the most successful, the outstanding American Indian political and military leader. At its height, his alliance was comprised of over 6,000 warriors from more than a dozen tribes, and you compare it to the largest Indian alliance in the West, which was that of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and they only mustered 1/3 as many warriors.
Wow.
So it's a dual biography of Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, who was known as the Shawnee Prophet, who started the movement that as a religious and cultural revitalization movement among the Indians in the Old Northwest in the early years of the 19th century. He was a mystic, a prophet, and among American Indians, what were regarded as true prophets were held in high regard, and they had a great deal of authority and prestige. Tenskwatawa started this movement to try to rejuvenate American Indian culture in the Midwest. And as it became apparent that the United States was going to continue chipping away at Indian lands in the Midwest, Tecumseh sort of he didn't co-opt the movement, but by mutual agreement, he and Tenskwatawa sort of shifted it more toward a political and military alliance to resist further American encroachment, to try to get all the Indians in the Midwest to work together to resist the United States efforts to chew up their land and kind of divide and conquer. And so it's a story not only of these two great Indian brothers who really, if you give Native Americans their due, Tecumseh and his brother loom as great and large in American history as the Kennedys do. I mean, they were remarkably important and transformative figures. So it's a story not only of these two, but also of the struggle to win over the Great Lakes states and the Midwest from the Indians.
And that book came out when?
In the midst of the pandemic in 2020, yeah. So my book tour consisted of a lot of things on Zoom.
My George Meade book came out during the pandemic too. So.
Not ideal timing.
No, it's incredible. Well, this the Tecumseh book interests me. I love early Kentucky history, and as a matter of fact, the foundation that sponsors these podcasts is conducting a tour come September of Daniel Boone and the Wilderness Road, and we're going down to we'll stay in Middlesboro, Kentucky, down near Cumberland Gap, and then the first day we'll go down to Sycamore Shoals, which of course was a holy ground to the Cherokee. It's there the Transylvania Company entered into an agreement with the Cherokee to acquire all the land between the Kentucky and Cumberland rivers. I mean, it's just an enormous amount of land. And for what trinkets they gave the Cherokee for that is astonishing, really. But that era of American history really fascinates me. And because, I mean, from Kentucky, I grew up around the Daniel Boone story. The attempts to settle a place like Kentucky was a horrific thing to behold, really. The exposure of people to attack from whoever, whether they're Great Lakes Indians or they're Cherokee, from the South. They all played a role in either trying to keep the white settlers from getting into Kentucky, and in the process there was some serious brutality in it.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the settlement of Kentucky looms large in Tecumseh and the Prophet in the early part of the book. Tecumseh and his brother were Shawnee Indians, and although the Shawnee lived north of the Ohio River in southern Ohio, they regarded, as did other tribes of southern Ohio, they regarded what is today Kentucky as their hunting land. They didn't live in Kentucky, but that was their hunting land, and they considered it to be theirs. And so these conflicts you speak of do figure heavily into the book. In fact, Daniel Boone was captured by the Shawnee and was a prisoner for several months, and I think most likely met the young warrior Tecumseh. Would have been surprised if he hadn't. And Tecumseh lost his elder brother in a raid, not in Kentucky, but actually in the Nashville area. So this whole area, again, Kentucky and north central Tennessee, does play a large role in the early part of my story.
Yeah. One of the sites we're going to be taking people to, among many, is a site within the confines now of Wilderness Road State Park in southern Kentucky. And there is the site of the graveyard of the McNitt family and the Barnes family. And I think there are like 24 members of that family were massacred just coming into Kentucky at that place. And you go and look at that, and it really does give you pause. One of the members of that contingent escaped. The woman, it was a woman, she was pregnant, and she found a way to conceal herself in a hollow tree and actually gave birth that night after that massacre. And the woman survived. And it's interesting, years ago, when I was a kid, my brother and I got a job working on the farm of a fellow who ran a spare parts and equipment business here in Lexington. He was a former Army quartermaster, and he was a Barnes. And he told us the story of that woman. That was his ancestor. And so anyway, when we make the stop down there and you go through it, I've known one person who managed to come into this world because that woman concealed herself. And
well, there's a flip side to you're talking about the Indian massacres of white settlers.
Yeah.
There's a flip side to that. Actually, the Shawnee were pretty tolerant at first, and in fact, when Daniel Boone first entered Kentucky, what is now Kentucky, with a group of fur hunters and potential settlers, the Shawnee captured them and just took away their hides, the hides that they had obtained, took away their weapons, and said, "Just don't come back. This is our land." And Boone ignored the admonition, and a few years later was captured by the same chief who spoke English and recognized Boone and said, "I told you not to come back. I said if you came back, you would forfeit your life." But he didn't kill Boone. Instead, Boone and his fellows were taken prisoner by the Shawnee and were adopted into the tribe. Which was a common occurrence. In fact, by the War of 1812, I would say upwards of maybe 20% of the Indian warriors in the Midwest were full-blooded white or part white, and a lot of whites, especially if they were adopted young, and even some who were taken prisoner and adopted into tribes as adults, actually preferred the Indian way of life to the hard scrabble living of settlers, and often resisted efforts to repatriate them to their white families.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's an interesting episode in Tecumseh and the Prophet. When Tecumseh was a young war leader, and he was fighting a skirmish with a bunch of Kentucky volunteers under a fellow named Simon Kenton, who was second only to Daniel Boone in fame and talent.
Right.
And Kenton and Boone were fighting a skirmish on the north side of the Ohio River, and there were, I forget the surname of the brothers involved, but one of the white brothers was fighting with Tecumseh's war party as a warrior, and his brother was fighting with the Kentuckians in this skirmish. And it was a small skirmish, maybe 4 dozen men involved in total. But one of the two Kentuckians killed was the brother of. His brother was fighting with Tecumseh, and so it was often brother against brother, because so many settlers did adopt the Indian way of life, and it was not continual hostility.
Yeah.
There were long periods when the two sides were able to get along and intermingle on a friendly basis.
Right.
So it was a complex story, really.
Yeah, that story of Daniel Boone is fun. He when he was released by those Shawnee, they told him, "You don't come back, or the wasps will sting you severely."
Yeah, that's right. Those are the words they used.
And he then had a dream about it.
Oh, really?
And there's a creek that runs through the town of Richmond, Kentucky, called Dreaming Creek, that he named because he was camping beside that creek when he woke up with this nightmare of being stung by all these bees and wasps, and he called it Dreaming Creek, and it bears that name today.
But it didn't dissuade him, though.
No, it didn't dissuade him. So, Simon Kenton. I mean, he's another story altogether.
And Simon Kenton, I guess the case again. There was not at this time was not a real deep racial hatred between the Indians and the settlers, because Simon Kenton eventually moved to Ohio,
right,
and maybe 15 years after these two skirmishes that he fought with Tecumseh, he and Tecumseh became friends, and they got along quite well. So it was not the racial hatred developed much later. I never felt in studies of Boone
that there was ever any hate.
No, not at all. No.
And I think that's something that has just popped up over the more modern times.
And it developed in the West to a degree that a much greater degree than was ever the case east of the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, maybe the nature of the people who settled the West, I don't know, but or the viciousness of the Plains tribes, whatever the cause, it seemed to be more of a factor in the West.
Yeah. It's all absolutely fascinating. You have a new book that is coming out, and tell us the listeners about it. It's called A Brutal Reckoning, and it's on Andrew Jackson, the Creek Indians, and the war for the American South.
The title is A Brutal Reckoning, Andrew Jackson, the Creek Indians, and the Epic War for the American South. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the most tragic episodes in American history and one of the most overlooked. Speaking of the Creek War, which is the focus of the book, although the book begins with the movement of Hernán de Soto and the conquistadores through the South and continues all the way through the Trail of Tears. But you have to recognize that as late as the beginning of the War of 1812, there was no Deep South as we know it. There was no cotton culture. There was no Dixie. There were 4 tribes that controlled the lion's share of the South: the Cherokee, which you've mentioned,
right,
the Creek Indians, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw. And the Creek Indians, they numbered about 25,000. They were a large tribe that were they were divided up into villages that, for all intent and purposes, were autonomous. And they came together as a confederacy only rarely, and only in a very tenuous way. But the Creeks controlled virtually all of modern-day Alabama, for the western 40% of Georgia, and a little bit of the eastern fringe of Mississippi and the southern fringe of Tennessee. And this was as late as the War of 1812. Mm-hmm. And they controlled what it was called the Black Belt, which is the richest soil in the Deep South for cotton production. And in 1811, there was a civil war that erupted among the Creek Indians, and it metastasized into a war against the United States and potential American encroachment on Creek Indian lands that occurred concurrently with the outbreak of the War of 1812. Mm-hmm. And the war began when an element of the Creeks who rose up against the United States, called the Red Sticks, sacked a place called Fort Mims in Alabama, and massacred more whites and mixed-race civilians than in any other episode in American history. And the ensuing Creek War was really a war for control of the Deep South. And had the British not been preoccupied with the Napoleonic War, I have no doubt that the Creeks would have prevailed with British help and would have retained the state of Alabama and much of western Georgia for at least another generation, which would have, it may never have been a civil war if that had been the case. There certainly wouldn't have been a cotton culture. More to the point, Andrew Jackson, there were, because the administration of President James Madison had its focus fixed northward on Canada and on defending the capital itself at one point. They left the conduct of the Creek War, as critical as it was to the fate of the South, they left it to the state and territorial militias of Georgia, Tennessee, and Mississippi to fight. And there were a number of invasions of the Red Stick country, which encompassed most of Alabama. And none of them succeeded. And Andrew Jackson himself staged 2 penetrations of the Red Stick country and fought inconclusive battles. And pretty much everybody by early 1814 was ready to give up. Even the governor of Tennessee told Jackson, "Come on home. This isn't worth it. Let the Creeks have their land." But Jackson said, "Nope, I'm going to see this through." And he persevered, managed to raise a large enough force to eventually engage a large Red Stick contingent at a battle called Horseshoe Bend in March 1814, a battle that's little known, but really determined ultimately the fate of the Deep South and led directly to the Trail of Tears 20-some years later, by which all the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw were sent westward. And in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Jackson killed more Indian warriors in a single day in that battle. To give you an idea of how bloody it was, the battle itself, then were lost by the Indians in all the conflicts in the American West put together. It was a remarkably bloody battle, but it was his victory at Horseshoe Bend, and not his subsequent victory at the Battle of New Orleans, that really placed Jackson on the national stage and made him a national hero. It was one of the few American victories in the War of 1812. And his victory at Horseshoe Bend, which led to the defeat of the Red Sticks, won him a major general's commission in the regular army. Previously, he had been merely a general in the Tennessee militia. And with that major general's commission came command of the military district that encompassed the South. And that placed him in a position to fight the British at the Battle of New Orleans. So the Creek War, it was, I think, the most important conflict fought between the United States and American Indians in our history.
Wow.
Because
cool.
it did determine the fate of the Deep South. It permitted the introduction of the cotton culture, and which led, of course, to the American Civil War.
Yeah.
And it has never been the subject of a book.
Yeah.
And so this book treats not only of the Creek War and its aftermath, and its as well as its antecedents, but also the rise of Andrew Jackson, from an obscure Tennessee militia general and Supreme Court justice to a national hero.
Yeah. Yeah, Peter, this has never been done.
No, it hasn't.
It's never been done. And, you get a kind of a cursory reading of him, even in the big biographies of Andrew Jackson.
Right.
It's like he was there. Okay, fine.
Yeah, suddenly he emerges as a hero of New Orleans, and then all of a sudden he's president. Well, how did he come to that? How did he come to New Orleans?
Yeah.
And that's
really,
overlooked.
Really interesting stuff. And the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, tell the listeners, when did that occur?
That was in March of 1814.
1814.
And one of the interesting things about that battle is that there was a large Cherokee contingent who fought with Andrew Jackson as mounted infantry. And Jackson, his plan, Horseshoe Bend is named for a horseshoe-shaped bend in the Tallapoosa River in Alabama. And Jackson's notion was the Red Sticks had built this incredible fortification, this incredible palisade across the mouth of the peninsula that was as formidable as any earthworks built in the American Civil War. And Jackson had a notion that, well, he could march up his infantry and his artillery force of 2 small cannon. And with these 2 small cannon on a knoll a few hundred yards from the palisade, he could knock down the palisade and force the 1,000 Red Stick defenders to back off and then attack and wipe out the warriors and take their village up against the bank of the Tallapoosa. And so that's how he planned the battle, and he had the Cherokee contingent along with his white cavalry cross downriver and take up a position on the far bank of the Tallapoosa River. The notion being that he would drive the warriors from their palisade through the village and up to the bank of the river, and the Cherokees who were along the bank itself would prevent the the Red Stick Warriors from escaping across the river. Oh, it didn't quite turn out that way. Jackson's cannon banged away, popped away for over an hour at these earthworks and did no damage whatsoever, while the Red Stick Warriors took pot shots at his infantry, who were standing there in line of battle waiting to go into action. And Jackson was mystified. He didn't know what to do. But a couple of Cherokee warriors on their own hook, lying in the bushes across the river, said, "Hey, look at all those red stick canoes on the other bank. How about we swim across and grab a couple and start crossing the river ourselves and attack this village?" And so the Cherokees on their own hook started crossing the Tallapoosa, and gradually, a couple hundred of them got across, and the accompanying white units thought this is not a bad idea, and they began crossing. But the Cherokee, they attacked the undefended Red Stick village, and when the sound of that fighting and word of that fighting reached the Red Stick warriors who were defending the palisade, a lot of them naturally, the family men, left the barricade to look after their families, natural reaction. And it was only then that Jackson decided to attack the palisades, the Red Stick defenses, with his infantry. And by then, the Red Stick defenses were so attenuated by their attempts to counter the Cherokee advance into their village that it was a fairly easy matter for Jackson to cross over the Indian fortifications and conduct a horrific, brutal slaughter of the Red Stick warriors and carry the day. But he won Horseshoe Bend and attained this subsequent fame as a result of actions by the Cherokee. Jackson did not even acknowledge the Cherokee role in his report of the battle. He took the credit for himself. And these same Cherokee young men who enabled him to achieve victory at Horseshoe Bend and ultimate fame, found themselves a part of the Cherokee Trail of Tears, being resettled against their will in Oklahoma 20-some years later.
Wow.
Ironic and tragic.
Wow. Yeah, it is. It is. It is. It came through my head while we've been talking. So many of the early confrontations between the ever-expanding white population into what were Indian country were fomented by the British. You think of the British during the Revolutionary War. I mean, they neither had the money, Britain, nor the manpower to fight a war over half a continent like this. And they used Indian tribes as their surrogate fighters. And you see this in the settlement of Kentucky, where always accompanying these Indians during their attempts to try to attack Boonesboro or whatever, they have a company of British with them. Mm-hmm. And this was kind of a pattern for a long while. I mean,
and continued through the War of 1812.
Yeah. And the same is true of another, the Six Nations in New York are the same thing there too, where the British are the ones giving them all the weapons, all the hunting, the knives, all the axes, everything else they want, and they do the bidding of the British.
Well, it wasn't, I think, I wouldn't say they were doing the bidding of the British as such. They were looking out for their own interests. Mm-hmm. The British, prior to the American Revolutionary War, and one of the causes of the Revolutionary War that has not been properly addressed in most histories was the desire of colonists to push west to the Appalachians,
right.
Initially to settle the Ohio Valley,
right.
Modern-day southern Ohio and Kentucky. And the British government issued a proclamation in the late 1760s prohibiting colonists from settling or surveying lands west of the Appalachians.
Right.
And people like Patrick Henry and George Washington had already sent surveyors out, anticipating a surge of emigration west of the Appalachians, and hoping to buy up land and clean up financially.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this desire on the part of colonists, and an understandable one, because especially in the South, the lands that were used to raise tobacco and whatnot were being exhausted, and the population was booming, and there was a class of poor farmers developing. There was a natural tendency to want to push west, and the British refusal to permit that was one of the causes of the American Revolutionary War. And the Indian tribes of the modern-day Midwest and the South, they recognized that the British did when they gained control of the Midwest from the French after the French-Indian Wars. The British did not want to settle this country. They planted a few forts here and there, but they didn't want to settle it. They wanted the trade in furs with the Indians. But so the Indians saw that the colonists indeed wanted their land. The British didn't. So it was a case of, hey, we fight with the British because they'll not only give us the arms and munitions with which to fight, and will fight with us, but they also, if they're victorious, they won't take our lands. Whereas if the colonists are victorious, they will come after our lands. They don't, and that was obvious to any Indian. So that's why they fought with the British.
Yes, the Proclamation of 1763.
Exactly.
And the colonists ignored that entirely.
Yes, they did, and so the Indians already had evidence of the several thousand of settlers who were here, in eastern Kentucky and in southern Ohio before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. They saw that the Americans won.
Yeah. Yeah.
It'd be a tidal wave.
Yeah. And it was.
Yeah, it was.
And it certainly was a tidal wave. But it is interesting, the settlers were coming into Kentucky in a land that was never occupied by the Indians.
Right.
Ever.
Which is odd. I mean, it's wonderful land, wonderful country, but it was not the tribal home to any particular tribe.
No. No. There's one site in near Winchester, Kentucky, called Escapakathiki. That was it was a trading post for a while, and where John Finley first stopped during his lone adventure into Kentucky before he met up with Daniel Boone. But this site apparently had some indications that there were these were all Shawnee, living there. But it didn't last very long, and it suddenly just evaporated. And when Boone actually came into Kentucky, it was no longer there.
Well, see, the Shawnee were an interesting tribe. They originated in the Ohio Valley, but were pushed out of the Ohio Valley when the Iroquois in the mid-1600s swept into the Ohio Valley and the Midwest and decimated or pushed westward the indigenous tribes. In the case of the Shawnee, they fragmented, and the Shawnee, they moved. There were Shawnee in Maryland, in the Shenandoah Valley. Some of the Shawnee went into modern Alabama to live with the Creeks. So the tribe was fragmented, and it was not until I don't recall the exact year. I think it was in early 1760s, late 1750s, before the Shawnee as a tribe came together again in the Ohio Valley. And so, they very well could have been a band that lived for a little while in Kentucky. I mean, they were a peripatetic tribe for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the only site ever of Indians, either those living across the Ohio, like the Shawnee, or the Cherokee, or any of the southern tribes. Mm-hmm. None of them ever settled here. Yeah. And but you're right. The British, what they kept aside was beyond the proclamation line, which ran along the summits of the Appalachians. They regarded the rest of the continent as an Indian reserve. Mm-hmm. The British did.
Right. They had no use for settling it. Again, they wanted the natural resources, specifically the hides, the deer hides and beaver skins and whatnot.
They also knew that the minute the white settlers got into that territory, there'd be fights.
Right, and that the British couldn't hold it. I mean, the British only had a handful of forts.
That's right.
Detroit, Mackinac, right. And 2 or 3 others.
Yeah. Really, it's a really interesting period of history of this country, and so little known out
and
there.
So crucial to what came subsequently.
Yes, exactly. Well, listen, it's been absolutely a treat having you here.
I've enjoyed myself thoroughly. Thank you so much, Ken.
And we'll have you back. How about that?
I'm all for it.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again.
My pleasure.
All right.
Become an American hero who participates in our mission by joining us at witnessinghistory.org. Download our documentaries and free teacher education materials that conform to grade-level education standards at pbslearning.org. Follow Witnessing History on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn.